When the Nazis pulled out of Greece in 1944, they left a power vacuum. The communist partisans who had fought and bled against the Axis expected to take over, but instead the country plunged into civil war. Britain, and later the United States, backed the royalist government with weapons and money. From 1946 to 1949, the communists controlled much of the countryside and even set up a provisional government. At their peak, they came dangerously close to Athens itself. The conflict had even fueled a split between Stalin and Tito. Stalin had promised Churchill in the percentages agreement that Greece would stay in the Western sphere, but Tito kept funneling support to the rebels anyway, infuriating Moscow. Meanwhile, the communists were fracturing and short on supplies, while the royalists were showered with American aid under the Truman Doctrine. The communist forces had lost all their support from infighting in the Eastern Bloc. By 1949, the last rebel fighters had retreated into Enver Hoxha's Albania, and the war was over. Had things gone a little differently, Greece might have joined Yugoslavia and Albania as another communist state in the Balkans. Instead, it became the very front line of the Cold War. Not that Greece was particularly Western or democratic when it came to dealing with its own dissidents. More on that in this video here. After World War II, Austria was carved into 4 occupation zones, with the Soviets controlling the east and the Western Allies in the west. In Vienna and the Soviet zone, the Communist Party of Austria, or the KPO, led by Johann Kopelnig, dreamed of turning at least part of the country into a socialist state. There were even discussions with Stalin about carving out an East Austria under communist control, similar to the division of Germany. For a brief period, it seemed plausible. Strikes erupted, industries were seized, and the KPO sought Soviet support to transform their modest 5.4% electoral backing into substantial power. But there were big obstacles. The KPO was losing ground in elections and never had broad support, and Moscow had little interest in creating a tiny, economically weak East Austria that would be dependent on them for little in return. A divided Austria would leave the western half closely tied to NATO, linking Germany and Italy, far from the Soviet strategic goals. Instead, the Soviets preferred a united, neutral Austria, which would act as a buffer zone in Central Europe. Negotiations over the Austrian State Treaty pushed the KPO to abandon its radical ambitions, siding with the idea of neutrality alongside moderates from other parties. By 1955, Austria emerged independent, united, and firmly outside the Iron Curtain. The moment Finland declared independence from Russia in December 1917, it took only 2 months before the country was at war with itself. Reds and whites turned neighbours into enemies overnight, and for a time it seemed Finland might become the very first Soviet satellite state. On one side were the Reds, workers, peasants, and leftists, inspired by the Russian Revolution next door. With Bolshevik arms and advisors, they seized Helsinki and most of southern Finland, declaring themselves the true government of the new republic. On the other side were the whites, conservatives, landowners, and middle-class Finns determined to stop communism. They had the loyalty of the officer corps and most crucially, backing from the German army. What followed was a short but vicious 3-month civil war. Towns changed hands in bloody street fighting like in the Battle of Tampere. Executions and massacres became common. Tens of thousands died in a country of barely 3 million. By May 1918, the whites, bolstered by German troops fresh from the Eastern Front who were still fighting World War I, crushed the Red strongholds. The dream of a Finnish Soviet Republic died on the battlefield. But it was a near thing, and had the Reds held out longer, Finland might have become the first Soviet satellite in Europe years before Eastern Europe fell to Moscow. And a not-so-fun fact, measured by percentage of the population killed per month, this was the deadliest civil war in the world, until Rwanda in 1994. If Finland was a communist dream crushed early, Spain's story was the opposite. The Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936 when generals under Francisco Franco rebelled against the democratically elected government. That government wasn't purely communist. It was a coalition of socialists, anarchists, and Republicans, but with Soviet backing, the Communist Party quickly grew in influence. In factories, villages, and whole cities, workers and peasants seized control, experimenting with revolutionary self-rule. For a moment, it seemed Spain might become the first communist-leaning democracy in Europe. As the Spanish Civil War dragged on, Britain and France tried to localize it with the 1936 non-intervention agreement, but while Germany and fascist Italy poured in planes, tanks and troops, Britain and France clung to appeasement and stood by. After 3 years of brutal civil war, the left finally collapsed. The last strongholds fell in 1939, and Spain remained under Franco's dictatorship for the next 36 years. Communism had been within reach, but instead, fascism won out. In March 1871, radical Parisians rose up and declared the Paris Commune, a short-lived experiment in the self-rule born out of defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Though not technically communist, the Commune embraced ideas that would later inspire Marxists: workers' control, secular education, women's participation in politics, and the abolition of a standing army. Marx himself hailed it as the first dictatorship of the proletariat. For 2 captivating months, Paris became a laboratory of radical democracy, but when French government troops stormed the city in May, the dream collapsed in blood. Tens of thousands were killed in the Bloody Week, and the Commune was crushed. Still, the Paris Commune remains one of Europe's earliest communist what-ifs, a moment when the red flag first flew over a capital city. In April 1974, young Portuguese officers launched the Carnation Revolution, toppling the Estado Novo dictatorship that had ruled for decades. What followed was a year of chaos. Workers seized factories, peasants occupied farms, and left-leaning military officers openly debated moving Portugal towards socialism. The Communist Party, though small, wielded enormous influence in the provisional government, and Moscow watched eagerly. After all, here was a NATO member on the verge of flipping sides. For a moment, it looked like Portugal might become the first communist country in Western Europe in the post-war era, minus San Marino, of course. A failed coup in November 1975 also brought Portugal dangerously close to becoming a communist state. But moderate socialists, centrist politicians, and Western support slowly pushed back. Following the failed coup, the radicals had mostly been sidelined, and Portugal stabilised into a democratic republic, independent but firmly in the Western sphere. Still, for a brief, electrifying moment, Portugal was Europe's communist what-if. After World War I, Italy was in turmoil. The country felt cheated by the so-called mutilated victory at Versailles, where promised territorial gains never materialized. The nation then plunged into economic crisis. Inflation soared, unemployment spiked, and returning veterans found little reward for their sacrifice. Amid this turmoil, workers launched massive strikes, peasants seized land, and factory councils inspired by the Russian Revolution briefly turned Turin and Milan into hotbeds of radical change. This period became known as the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years. Socialist and communist parties surged in popularity, and revolution seemed imminent. But the left was divided, and landowners and industrialists turned to a new movement for protection: Benito Mussolini's fascists. By 1922, the momentum had shifted, and instead of communism, Italy got fascism.